A man sits down to dinner in London on an ordinary evening in the autumn of 1485. He has spent the day the way men of his sort spend their days, and he feels perfectly well as the food is brought out and the candles are lit against the early dark. Somewhere between the first course and the second, a strange thing happens at the back of his neck. A cold prickle runs up under his collar. He shivers and cannot stop shivering, and the cold turns into a deep ache that settles into his shoulders and his arms and grinds down into the long bones of his legs. His head begins to pound. He feels dizzy, then frightened without knowing why, and the fear itself seems to be part of whatever is happening to him. Within an hour, the cold has flipped into a furnace. Sweat pours off him, soaking through his shirt, running off his face and pooling under him, and it carries a smell so foul that the people around him step back. He raves. He begs for water and cannot be given enough of it. His heart hammers against his ribs and then aches as though someone is pressing on it. And then comes the worst part. The part that made this thing famous, an overwhelming, sucking need to sleep, a heaviness he cannot fight, and everyone in the room knows that if he closes his eyes, he will not open them again. He was well at dinner. Before the household has finished clearing the table, he is dead. That is how fast it moved. That is what the people of Tudor England were up against, and we're going to spend a good long while inside it with them today. This particular horror is one of the strangest things that ever happened to that country, and almost nobody talks about it. It has no famous name in the popular memory. It gets no anniversary. And yet, for a stretch of about 66 years, it could reach into a healthy morning and pull a grown adult out of it before the light changed, and it did that to thousands upon thousands of people, and then it vanished off the face of the earth and took its secret with it. Before I get properly into it, let me say a quick hello. Welcome in and thank you for being here. I'm always genuinely curious about who's out there on the other side of this, so do me a favor and drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're listening from. And to everyone supporting the channel over on Patreon and through the YouTube memberships, thank you. If you'd like to help keep these coming, the links to support the channel are down in the description and pinned right at the top of the comments, so they're easy to find. Right. With that out of the way, back to the beginning of all this, and the beginning is grim enough on its own. The disease had a lot of names. People called it the sweat, or the sweating sickness, or the English sweat, and the physicians who wanted to sound learned about it reached for Latin and called it sudor anglicus, the English sweat dressed up in a dead language. That name carried something the English themselves were painfully aware of, that this thing seemed to belong to them in particular, that it followed English bodies around Europe and left almost everyone else more or less alone. We'll come to Europe and to that strange loyalty the disease seemed to have. The first time it showed its face, as far as the surviving records let us see, was in the late summer of 1485, and it arrived in the middle of one of the most famous moments in all of English history. Henry Tudor had just won at Bosworth Field. That was the 22nd of August, 1485, the day Richard III was cut down in the mud with his crown supposedly plucked out of a thorn bush, the end of the Plantagenet line and the start of the Tudor century. Henry marched south with his army. He entered London at the end of August as a conquering king, a man who had spent almost his whole life in exile and was now suddenly master of a country he barely knew. He had won the throne by force. His claim to it was thin and everyone knew it, and there were still plenty of men in England who thought of him as an upstart and a foreigner propped up by mercenaries. His grip was anything but secure, and almost the instant his army settled into the capital, people started dropping dead in the streets. The chroniclers noticed the timing, and a lot of them made something of it. Polydore Virgil, the Italian scholar who later wrote the official history of Henry's reign, described this new sickness as a plague no earlier age had ever suffered, a deadly sweating that came on suddenly and tortured the head and the stomach with an unbearable heat, so that scarcely 1 in 100 of the sick survived. Virgil was writing for the Tudor court, and had no reason at all to insult his patrons, and even he recorded the popular mutter that ran through London that autumn, the feeling that a reign which opened with a plague like this was a reign fated to be a harsh one. You can almost hear the ordinary Londoner in that line, standing at the edge of a fresh grave, doing the grim sum in his head about what sort of king God had just handed them. A crown taken in blood, and then a sickness that killed men where they stood. It did not feel like a blessing. Whether Henry's soldiers actually brought the sweat with them, nobody can say for certain, and I'm not going to pretend the sources are cleaner than they are. Henry's army was a mixed and motley thing. He had raised money and men on the continent during his long exile, and among his troops were French and Breton fighters, and quite possibly German and Swiss ones too, hardened professional fighters. Hired men, the ones you paid for when you were trying to seize a kingdom on borrowed strength. The idea that some of these men carried the disease into England is old, and it's tempting, because the outbreak really does seem to explode at the very moment they arrive. But tempting is a long way from proven, and the honest truth is that we have no body, no smoking gun, no name for whatever came off those ships and out of that camp. What we have is a coincidence that everyone at the time found deeply, superstitiously unsettling, and that historians ever since have circled without ever quite closing on. What is not in doubt is what happened next in London. The sweat tore through the city through September and into October. Estimates from the period suggest something like 15,000 people died in the space of about 6 weeks, in a city that may have held only 50,000 souls to begin with. I'd hold those numbers loosely, because Tudor chroniclers were not running careful surveys and they loved a big, frightening figure. But even if the real number was a fraction of that, it was a catastrophe on a scale that stopped the city in its tracks. And the disease got right into the government of London itself, into the men who ran the place. The Lord Mayor of London, Thomas Hill, died of the sweat on the 23rd of September. The man chosen to replace him, Sir William Stocker, took up the office and then died just 2 days later, around the 25th. 6 aldermen died. 3 sheriffs died. The men who governed the greatest city in England were being scythed down faster than the city could appoint their successors. Something almost darkly absurd sits in that picture. An office of state that keeps killing everyone who sits down in the chair. A chain of dead mayors handing a poisoned crown of office from one corpse to the next inside a single fortnight. Henry had a problem on top of his grief and his fear. He was supposed to be crowned, and he could hardly hold a magnificent coronation while the streets of his brand new capital were choked with the dying and the dead. So he waited. The coronation was pushed back to the end of October, to the 30th of 1485, once the worst of the sweat had burned itself out. Even his marriage to Elizabeth of York, the union that was meant to knit the warring houses of Lancaster and York back together and finally close the long open wound of the civil wars, took place the following January under the shadow of what had just happened. The new dynasty, the dynasty that would give England some of its most famous and infamous monarchs, was born into a country still wiping the sweat and the corpses off its hands. One more detail from the very start of all this sticks with me, and it comes from before Bosworth rather than after. When Henry was gathering his forces and desperately needed Thomas Stanley to bring his men over to his side, Stanley reportedly sent back word that he could not come at once because he was suffering from the sweating sickness. If that's accurate, and it comes from the Croyland account, then the disease was already circulating right before the battle that changed everything. One historian who studied Richard's final days closely has even floated the possibility that Richard III himself had the sweat the night before he died, which would help explain those accounts of a sleepless, thirst-tormented king lying awake and haunted in his tent while his army waited for the dawn and the slaughter. I can't tell you that's what happened, and I won't dress a guess up as a fact. But it's a strange thought to hold that the man who lost his crown and the country he lost it to may both have been touched by the same invisible thing in the same handful of weeks, and that the whole Tudor age may have opened with a shiver running up the back of a doomed king's neck. What did this sickness actually do to a person? I've been circling the edges of it, and you deserve the whole picture before we go any further into the history. The best account we have of the symptoms comes from a physician named John Caius, and I'll come back to him properly later on. He lived through the last outbreak and wrote the only real medical study of the disease that survives from anyone who watched it work. Caius and the chroniclers together let us assemble a fairly precise sequence of what the sweat did to a human body from the first moment to the last, and it is not a gentle sequence. I'll take it slowly. The speed of the disease is the whole horror of it, and that speed only lands once you understand what was being crammed into those few hours. It began, Caius wrote, with a sense of apprehension, a feeling of dread that came before any physical pain at all, a bone-deep certainty that something was wrong, a wrongness with no cause you could name. Then the cold stage arrived and took the dread and gave it a body. Violent shivering, sometimes so severe that the whole frame shook and the teeth rattled, along with dizziness, a splitting headache, and deep grinding pains that dug into the neck and the shoulders and out along the limbs. A terrible exhaustion came with it, a leaden heaviness in the arms and the legs, so that a man who had walked briskly into a room an hour before could barely lift his own hand. This cold phase could stretch anywhere from half an hour to 3 hours. The victim knew, everyone around them knew, what the cold meant, and there was nothing to do but wait for the second stage. Because the second stage was coming whether they were ready for it or not. The hot stage was the drenching one, the one that gave the disease its name and its reputation. A furious internal heat rose up out of nowhere, as if the body had been set alight from the inside. The headache boiled over into full delirium, so that the sufferer stopped making sense, raved, saw things, no longer knew the faces of the people leaning over the bed. The pulse raced and pounded. Thirst came on so fiercely that no amount of water could touch it, and the water they were given, if they were given any, seemed to do nothing at all. The heart was heavily, agonizingly involved. Victims reported palpitations, a heartbeat that stumbled and skipped and slammed, and a real physical pain in the chest, an agony centered on the heart itself, as though a fist were closing around it. Some accounts describe a terrible difficulty in breathing, a sense of the chest tightening, of the lungs filling and failing. One physician who saw the disease firsthand in 1485 spoke of loathsome vapors gathering around the heart and the lungs, and that's precisely the language a man reaches for when he's watching people drown on dry land, choking and gasping with not a drop of water in sight. And then, pouring over all of it, the sweat itself, sudden, profuse and foul. The whole body opened up and poured out fluids so heavily that clothes and bedding were soaked through in minutes, drenched, dripping, and the smell that came off it was so strong and so vile that observers commented on it again and again in disgust and horror. Edward Hall's Chronicle and Polydore Virgil both note that the sweat carried a great and powerful stench. The sick room, then, if you can stomach it. The shivering that turns to raving, the pounding, failing heart, the man clawing at his own chest and screaming for water that gives him nothing, this reeking flood coming off his body and soaking the sheets while he sinks, hour by hour, toward the one thing everyone crowded into that room is most afraid of: sleep. The final symptom, the one Caius believed was the killer, was an irresistible, crushing pull towards sleep. The sufferer would beg to be allowed to close their eyes, would plead and then fight anyone who tried to keep them awake, and the physicians of the day were utterly convinced that to let them sleep was to let them die. So they didn't. They kept them up by any means they had. They shook them, shouted at them, talked at them, pinched and slapped and prodded, walked them up and down, refused to let those eyelids fall, sometimes for a full day and a full night, because staying conscious for 24 hours seemed to be the whole difference between the ones who woke up on the far side and the ones who never did. Notice what's missing from all of this. No rash, no spots, no swellings, no black boils in the armpit or the groin like the buboes that marked out the plague. That absence terrified people almost more than a visible mark would have, because there was nothing to see, nothing to point at, no way to know who was already carrying it and who was safe, no way to tell the doomed from the healthy until the shivering started. And there was one more cruelty stitched into the very design of the thing. Surviving it gave you nothing. Live through smallpox and you're safe from it for life. Live through the sweat and you could catch it again the next week, and again the week after that, and it might take you on the second try or the third. Some people appear in the records as having suffered the sweat several separate times before it finally finished them, dragged back from the edge again and again only to be pushed off it in the end. The whole thing, from that first cold dread at the back of the neck to death, could run its entire course in as little as 2 or 3 hours. Most of the deaths seem to have fallen inside a window of about 8 to 10 hours, though some accounts stretch it out to 18. And the rule everyone knew, the rule that quietly decided your fate, was brutally simple. If you could survive the first 24 hours, you would very likely live and recover completely. No lingering illness, No slow convalescence, just up and well again. If you couldn't survive those hours, you were gone before the day had turned over. That knife edge is where the famous line comes from, the one that echoes through nearly every account of this disease, the observation that a man could be merry at dinner and dead at supper. Caius put it in his own words, that to those who had dined in good cheer, the sweat gave a sorrowful supper. 2 meals. That was sometimes the entire span of it. Laughing over one, in the ground before the next. A physician named Thomas Forestier stood in the streets of London during the 1485 outbreak and wrote down what he saw with his own eyes. And it sounds less like a medical treatise and more like a fever dream. He described 2 priests standing together in the street, talking, and both of them dying suddenly, right there, mid-conversation, collapsing where they stood. He described the wife of a tailor, taken all at once, dead in moments. He described a young man walking down an ordinary street who simply fell and died. People dropping mid-sentence, mid-step, going down in doorways and on the cobbles with no warning that anyone could see, one instant upright and alive, and the next a body on the ground. Forestier also emphasized the breathlessness, the sense of the chest and the lungs being smothered by those loathsome vapors. And that emphasis is part of why some of the modern guesses about the disease lean towards something that attacked the lungs. This was a sickness that could reach into an ordinary Tuesday morning and yank a strong, healthy adult clean out of it before noon, and leave the people who'd been standing next to them staring at a corpse and wondering if the cold was already climbing up their own necks. Something about the sweat felt personal to the people it hunted, almost malicious. It went after the strong. Famine, plague, most of the great killers of that age preyed on the weak, on children and the old and the already sick, on the poor with nothing in their bellies to fight with. The sweat turned that on its head. Over and over the chroniclers noticed, with something close to bewilderment, that it fell hardest on men in the absolute prime of life, on the well-fed, the wealthy, the fit and the vigorous, and especially on men somewhere between 30 and 40 years old. Holinshed's chronicle says it flatly, that the mortality fell chiefly upon men, and men of the best age, and that few women, few children, and few old men died of it. Caius said the ones who suffered it most dangerously were men of wealth and ease and comfort, or else idle men, good ale drinkers and tavern haunters. So the disease seemed to seek out precisely the people who had the most reason to feel invincible. The healthy young courtier at the height of his charm, the prosperous merchant with money in his strongbox. It walked straight past the frail and the starving, and took the ones who thought nothing could touch them, and it took them fast. That habit earned the disease a nickname, and it's one of the most telling nicknames any illness has ever picked up. People called the sweat stoop gallant, or sometimes stoop knave, because it made the proud stoop. It brought down the gallant young men, the show-offs in their fine clothes at the front of the crowd, the ones who strutted. A hard, mocking wisdom sits folded into that name, a bitter recognition that the fine young man who thought so much of himself in the morning was on his knees by the afternoon and in the ground by nightfall, and that all his health and money and good breeding didn't buy him one single extra hour. Death, in the shape of the sweat, was the great leveler, and it seemed to take a special interest in leveling the ones who stood tallest. The accounts let us into the sick room, and the reality in there was far uglier than the tidy word sweating suggests. A body in the grip of this disease became a difficult, frightening thing to be near. The fluid pouring off the skin came in a flood, soaking through a linen shirt, then the sheets beneath, then the mattress, so that the bedding had to be wrung out and changed and wrung out again, while the patient raved and thrashed, and all of it stank, a thick, sour reek that filled the room and clung to the clothes of anyone who tended the sick and would not wash out easily. The delirium made the sufferer dangerous to handle. A grown man in the burning stage did not lie there quietly waiting to be nursed. He fought. He tore at his own soaked clothing, at the bedclothes, at the hands trying to hold him down, screaming for water, and then knocking away the cup when it came, seeing things in the corners of the room, calling out to people who were not there, or to people who had died in that same house the week before. The heart pain doubled some of them over, clutching at their chests, and the breathlessness turned others grey and gasping, their lips working, the air whistling in and out of a chest that could not seem to fill. And under all of it ran that terrible tidal pull towards sleep, dragging the eyelids down, so that the people holding the vigil were fighting the disease and the patient both, prying eyes back open, shaking a shoulder, shouting a name into a face that no longer knew them. The ones who lost that fight simply stopped. The raving faded into stillness, the drenched body went slack, the laboured breathing slowed and caught and stopped, and a person who had been laughing at a table that same morning was a corpse in a soaked bed by the time the candles guttered. And the corpses came so fast, in the bad years, that the ordinary machinery of death could not keep pace with them. Bodies waited in houses, bodies waited in churchyards for graves that hadn't been dug yet, because the men who dug graves were sick too, or dead too, or had fled. In the worst weeks, the dead went into the ground, stripped of ceremony, wrapped and buried quickly and shallowly out of a terror of contagion. Whole families lowered into the same fresh pit, because there was no time and no strength and no one left to do it properly. The living learned to move through streets where a shape lying in a doorway might be a drunk sleeping it off, or might be a man who had felt the shiver an hour ago and gone down where he stood, and you did not go close enough to find out. The thing that gnawed at people most, I suspect, was the invisibility of it. Plague at least announced itself. The buboes swelled in the armpit and the groin, black and hard and unmistakable, so that a man could look at his own body and know, and others could look at him and keep away. The sweat gave you nothing to look at. A person carrying whatever this was looked exactly like a person who was perfectly well, right up until the moment they weren't, and so every face in every crowded room during an outbreak was a question with no answer. The friend across the table, the servant bringing the food, the child on your knee, the stranger you passed in the street, any of them might already have it moving in their blood, and you would not know and could not know until the shivering started, and by then it was often already too late for both of you. People stopped shaking hands. They flinched from breath and from touch. A cough in a quiet room could empty it. The disease poisoned the ordinary trust that lets people sit together in a room, and it did that over and over for the better part of a century. Every time the weather turned warm and the rumour started up again that the sweat was somewhere to the west or the north or already in the next street. After that first savage year, the sweat went quiet for a long while and the country got to breathe again. It didn't return in force for more than 20 years. Then, somewhere around 1508, it came back. This second outbreak is frustratingly thin in the records, and I won't pretend to more than we have. It ran through the summer and the autumn. It was less widespread and seems to have been less deadly than the first Great Visitation, and it stayed inside England rather than spreading further afield. It reached Oxford and Cambridge again, the two great universities, and that pattern repeats itself right through the story. Crowded halls full of young men turned out to be superb hunting ground for a disease with a taste for young men. Beyond a handful of scattered mentions, though, that middle outbreak has mostly slipped through the cracks of history. Some sources even quarrel over whether it truly fell in 1507 or 1508, and the fact that we cannot pin down the year at all says plenty about how faint the trail has gone. It's almost a gap in the story, a held breath between the two really terrible visitations, a reminder that most of what happened in the past was never written down at all. The third outbreak, in 1517, was no gap. It was one of the worst of the entire run. It came on around the middle of the year, and this time it dug into the towns of England with a real savage ferocity. In some places, contemporaries claimed half the population died. Half. Oxford and Cambridge were struck so hard that the scholars fled and the halls emptied out. Thomas More, the famous humanist scholar and future Lord Chancellor, wrote to his friend Erasmus that summer with genuine fear in his words, telling him that multitudes were dying all around them, that almost everyone in Oxford and in Cambridge and in London had lately been ill. This was More, mind you, a clear-eyed and level-headed man not remotely given to hysterics, and he was describing a country where sudden death had become the ordinary background of daily life, where you could not have a conversation without wondering which of the two of you might be shivering by evening. The court felt the 1517 outbreak too, and felt it sharply. Henry VIII was still a young man then, still the golden prince of the early years, athletic and glittering, long before the ulcerated leg and the paranoia of his later reign. And even in those bright early years, he was already showing the terror of illness that would shape his whole lifelong relationship with this particular disease. He pulled his court out of London the moment the sweat took hold. He moved to Richmond, then on to Greenwich, then to Windsor, and then reportedly fled further still, to some remote and unusual place where he was convinced the sickness could not find him. He surrounded himself with as few people as possible because every person was a possible carrier, and the sweat still reached in through all of it and touched his household. Pages who slept in the king's own bedchamber died. Lord Grey died. Members of the kitchen staff and the stables died, and it took one man whose death cut Henry personally and cut the whole learned humanist world of the age, a scholar named Andrea Ammonio. Ammonio was Italian, a gifted poet and scholar, and he served as Henry's Latin secretary, drafting the elegant Latin letters a Renaissance king needed to send out to popes and emperors and fellow monarchs. He was also a close friend and constant correspondent of Erasmus, one of the very brightest minds Europe had produced. When the sweat came in 1517, Ammonio did the sensible, prudent thing and left the court for the countryside, trying to put clean air and distance between himself and the infected city. It didn't save him. The sweat caught up with him and killed him around the 17th or 18th of August, roughly 3 days after he had fled to what he thought was safety, and he was not yet 40 years old. Thomas More was the one who had to break the news. He wrote to Erasmus on the 19th of August, telling his friend that Ammonio was dead. Erasmus was shattered. He had lost a dear friend to something that killed in a matter of hours. A man of learning and promise and wit struck down in a borrowed refuge out in the fields, with no enemy to curse and no wound to point at. Nothing but a body that had drowned itself overnight in its own sweat. For the great scholars of the day, men who lived by letters and friendship across the whole of Europe, the loss cut especially deep. The disease had reached right into their small bright circle and snuffed out one of its own. The sweat receded once again, as it always did, and England limped on through the next decade. Then came the outbreak that most people who've heard of this disease at all have actually heard of, if they've heard of any of them, because it collided head-on with the most famous marriage crisis in English history, 1528, the year the sweat walked straight into the middle of Henry VIII's obsession with Anne Boleyn. The earliest firm sign of it that year comes from the 5th of June, in a letter written by a royal official named Brian Tuke, who mentioned that he had fled out to Stepney to get away from a servant of his who had come down with the sweat. It's a small domestic detail, one worried man shifting houses to dodge one sick servant, but it's the opening note of an epidemic that would go on to sweep the whole country and then leap the sea entirely. London was hit hard and fast. The French ambassador, a man named Jean du Bellay, was in the city and wrote back to France with descriptions that are among the most vivid we possess of what a sweat outbreak actually felt like on the ground, from inside it, and they are genuinely, lastingly disturbing. Du Bellay described people dropping in the streets and in the shops, and others hurrying indoors the instant they felt that first telltale shiver, desperate to get to a bed and take the sweat under cover, rather than have it take them out in the open where they'd fall on the stones. He described one great household in which 18 people died in the space of 4 hours. 18 in 4 hours under a single roof. He wrote about the notaries, the men who drew up wills, having the busiest time of their entire lives, because everyone who fell sick wanted their affairs set in order before the delirium came and took their minds and their words away. And Du Bellay reckoned that something like 100,000 wills had been dashed off in a frantic hurry as the disease raced through the city. He said the sick went mad the very moment the sickness turned severe, which lines up exactly with the delirium described in the clinical accounts. And he left behind one line that has stuck with me ever since I first came across it. That if you so much as put a hand out from under the bedclothes during those crucial 24 hours, you instantly went stiff as a peacock. He was describing the way even a small chill could tip a struggling patient right over the edge into death. But the image of the body seizing up, going rigid and cold at the tiniest exposure of a bare hand to the air, does not leave you once you have heard it. The mortality in London that year is genuinely hard to pin down, and this is one of those places where I'd rather show you the mess than pretend it's tidier than it is. Some contemporary reports suggest a mortality of only around 5% among those actually infected, which sounds almost survivable, almost bearable. Du Bellay, standing right there in the city, wrote that by late June, something like 2,000 people had already died in London, out of the tens of thousands who had been struck by it. Both of those figures can be partly true, depending on what exactly you're counting and at what moment. The honest summary is that an enormous number of people got sick, a great many of them did pull through, and a genuinely frightening number of them did not, all inside a few compressed weeks, and the whole city ground to a halt while it was happening. Shops shut their doors. Business simply stopped. People stopped caring about anything at all except whether they and the people they loved would still be breathing at the end of the day. The disease spread out from London across almost the whole of England that summer, and it reached over the water into Ireland, where it killed Hugh Inge, the Lord Chancellor of Ireland, on the 3rd of August 1528. But it left Scotland almost entirely alone, one of those maddening geographic quirks we'll have to sit with properly later on. And in the middle of all of this national dying, the sweat walked into Henry VIII's court and, in a manner of speaking, into his heart. And from here, the story narrows down to a small handful of very famous people sweating and raving in the dark. Anne Boleyn had been sent away from court to Hever Castle, the Boleyn family home down in Kent, partly for her own safety and partly because the whole situation between her and the king was a diplomatic powder keg that everyone wanted to keep at arm's length while Rome was watching. And at Hever, Anne caught the sweat. So did her father, Thomas Boleyn, and her brother George. The woman Henry was in the process of tearing his entire kingdom apart to marry was lying at Hever with the disease that killed people in a matter of hours, and Henry was somewhere else, terrified out of his mind, and unable to go to her because going to her meant walking straight into the infection himself, and Henry VIII was not a man who walked toward death for anyone. We actually have his letters from this exact moment, and they are a strange, raw window into a man who was normally so guarded and so dangerous. Henry wrote to Anne the instant he got word that she was ill, and the letter is almost fumbling in its fear, the handwriting of a man rattled to his core. He told her that the news of her sickness was the most afflicting news that could possibly have reached him. He told her that he esteemed her more than all the world, that her health mattered to him as much as his very own, and that he would gladly bear half of her illness upon his own body if it would make her well. Then he clung to whatever thin comfort he could scrape together. In another letter, he tried to reassure himself at least as much as her, pointing out that in this particular outbreak, few or no women seemed to be dying, and that no one of his court and few elsewhere had died of it, a hopeful way of looking at the situation, and not really a true one at all. But you can hear a frightened man talking himself down off a ledge, arranging the facts into the shape he needs them to be. He couldn't go to her himself, so he sent the next best thing he had. His own first-choice physician was unavailable, so Henry dispatched his second-choice doctor, a man named William Butts, riding hard out to Hever to tend to Anne. And Anne recovered. So did her father and her brother. The sweat spared the Boleyns entirely that year. which, given everything that came afterward, is one of history's colder ironies, because the disease that killed strangers in 4 hours passed clean over the woman whose fate would be a swordsman brought over specially from Calais and a scaffold on Tower Green just 8 years later. The sweat let Anne Boleyn live so that other, slower, more human cruelties could reach her in their own time. No shape to that, and no justice in it. That's simply the way it fell. The disease was not so gentle with the man married to Anne's sister. Mary Boleyn's husband was William Carey, a courtier, an esquire of the king's body, a man very much on the rise in Henry's orbit. He caught the sweat in that same 1528 outbreak and died of it on the 22nd of June, leaving Mary a widow in real, immediate financial difficulty, scrambling for support and protection. And Carey was far from alone among the men close to the king. Sir William Compton, one of Henry's most trusted courtiers and companions from his youth, a powerful and enormously wealthy man, died in the outbreak. Francis Poyntz died. Du Bellay recorded that at one point nearly every single man in the king's privy chamber, the innermost ring of the household, the men who dressed the king and slept near him and served him in his most private and unguarded moments, had been struck down by the disease. Henry was watching his closest companions fall around him one after another, men he'd hunted and jousted and laughed with, and he responded the only way he knew how. He ran. His fear of illness and death was already the stuff of legend, and 1528 drove it to a fever pitch. Henry broke up his court entirely. He sent most of his household away from him. He gathered a tiny knot of people around himself and started moving, constantly, restlessly, from house to house, from manor to manor, sometimes changing where he slept every few days, staying always just ahead of wherever he imagined the sickness might be waiting for him. He took what amounted to strict quarantine measures. He was fascinated by medicine, always had been, and he threw himself into his own remedies and plasters and preventatives, mixing things and applying things and believing devoutly in them. And through all of it he wrote his anxious letters and waited for word that the people he cared about had made it through another night alive. For a man who would go on to become one of the most fearsome and unpredictable figures in all of European history, a man who executed wives and ministers and old friends almost as a matter of routine, the court that summer became a strange, shrunken, wandering thing. The King of England, the man the whole apparatus of the realm existed to serve, reduced to a small huddle of trusted servants moving quietly from one country house to the next, keeping the numbers around him as low as he dared, turning away anyone who might carry the sickness in. Ambassadors trying to conduct the serious business of Europe found the king a moving target, hard to reach, hard to pin down, his household stripped back to the bone. The ordinary rituals of a Tudor court, the crowds of hangers-on, the constant coming and going of people seeking favour, all of it thinned out to almost nothing while Henry ran. And into that emptied-out summer fell the most important negotiation of his life, the effort to be rid of Catherine and free to marry Anne, both of them scattered to different houses, Anne recovering at Hever, the king writing his frightened letters, the papal legate crawling toward England behind them all. A crisis of state and a crisis of disease braided together into one long anxious season, and at the center of it a king who could command armies and courts, and the deaths of men sitting in a borrowed house somewhere in the countryside, unable to command the one thing he wanted most. Any certainty at all that the people he loved would still be breathing in the morning. The timing of this particular outbreak was a genuine disaster for Henry in a way that reached far beyond his personal terror, because 1528 was a critical year in what he called his great matter, his grinding campaign to have his marriage to Catherine of Aragon annulled so that he could marry Anne. Rome had finally sent a cardinal, Lorenzo Campeggio, over to England to hear the case, and everything hinged on the legal process actually moving forward and reaching a verdict. But Campeggio was slow, painfully slow. He was suffering badly from gout and had to be carried for much of the journey, and he didn't reach Dover until late September 1528. And into that already delicate, already dragging situation, the sweat dropped like a lit fuse, scattering the court to the winds, disrupting the council, snarling every line of communication, making it dangerous to gather any group of people anywhere for any purpose. The epidemic did not, on its own, cause the failure of Henry's annulment, but it fed the delay, and the delay fed the frustration, and the frustration would in time help destroy Cardinal Wolsey and crack England away from the Church of Rome altogether. A disease that killed in hours managed to reach one clammy hand right into the machinery of the English Reformation and give it a shove. Speaking of Wolsey, he's one of the survivors in this story, and his experience shows you the peculiar cruelty of a disease that granted no immunity to those it spared. Cardinal Wolsey, Henry's great minister, the butcher's son who had climbed to the second most powerful position in the kingdom, caught the sweat more than once and lived through it every single time. Some accounts have him suffering several attacks in a very short span of weeks, and then coming down with it all over again years later. Every recovery brought him nothing, no protection, no safety, no peace of mind. It only handed him the knowledge that the thing had already tried to kill him and could come back and try again whenever the season turned warm. He kept working, kept scheming, kept raising his magnificent palaces at Hampton Court and York Place, all while carrying inside him the memory of a sickness that had drenched and raved him and might do it again next summer. The sweat also reached into the family of another man who would come to loom enormous over Tudor England, Thomas Cromwell. Around this same period, roughly 1528 into 1529, Cromwell lost his wife Elizabeth and two of his daughters, and the disease is widely held responsible for taking them from him. Cromwell, the ruthless, self-made fixer who would go on to engineer the break with Rome and the machinery of Anne Boleyn's own destruction, came home to a house emptied of his wife and his girls. Whatever else you think of the man, and history has thought a great many hard and cold things about Thomas Cromwell, he grieved real people who had been alive and warm in his house, and the thing that took them from him was the same reeking, invisible sweat that was emptying households up and down the length of the country that season, the great and the humble alike, with no regard for either. Now 1528 is also the year the sweat did something it had never done before in all its outbreaks. It left the island. Up to this point, the disease had been an English problem, jumping over to Ireland now and then, but otherwise staying home, and the continent had watched it from a safe distance with a mix of pity and quiet superiority, glad it was somebody else's curse. In 1529, that changed, and it changed with terrifying speed. The sweat crossed the sea and got into Europe, and once it was loose there, it moved in a way that must have felt genuinely supernatural to the people in its path. The way it seems to have travelled was, fittingly, on a ship. The disease is recorded arriving in Hamburg in July of 1529, apparently carried in by a vessel out of England, and once it landed in that crowded, busy port, it detonated. Somewhere around 1,100 people are said to have died in Hamburg in the space of just 4 or 5 weeks. From that first landing, it ran along the Baltic coast like fire through summer grass. It struck Lübeck. It reached Stettin at the end of August and Danzig at the start of September. It pushed north into Schleswig-Holstein, into Denmark, up into Sweden and Norway. It drove south into the German heartland, into Strasbourg and Frankfurt and Cologne and Marburg and Göttingen, all through September of 1529. It pressed further east still, toward Lithuania and Poland, and some accounts carry it all the way into Russia. And it did something truly eerie in the Low Countries. Antwerp and Amsterdam both reported the sweat breaking out on the very same morning, the 27th of September, 2 separate cities lighting up with the identical disease on the identical day, as though it had simply appeared everywhere at once out of the air. The pattern in each place it touched was the same as it had always been back home. It arrived. It raged for a week or 2. It killed and terrified and emptied houses, and then it moved on and burned itself out. It rarely stayed in any one town longer than a couple of weeks. And then, by the end of 1529, having torn across a vast stretch of northern Europe and killed God only knows how many thousands, it withdrew from the continent almost entirely, lingering only in one corner of the Swiss lands, and it never came back to mainland Europe again, not once. That whole continental invasion was a single savage guest appearance, one terrible season of dying, and then it was simply gone, as if it had grown bored of the place. Europe had no defense against it and no experience of it, and the panic in the German towns was something to behold. These were places that knew plague, that had buried their thousands before and thought they understood how sickness worked, how it crept and simmered and gave you time to flee or to pray. The sweat gave them none of that. In a city like Hamburg or Cologne, people went to their beds well and were carried out of their houses dead the next day, and the disease did in a fortnight what plague took a season to do, and then it was gone before the survivors had finished burying the dead, which left them stunned, staring at emptied streets, unsure whether the thing had ended or was only holding its breath. The great reformer Martin Luther was alive and preaching in Germany during this continental visitation, and the arrival of a swift new English pestilence in the middle of the religious upheaval he had set going was taken, by plenty of frightened people on all sides, as a sign, though of course they could not agree on what it was a sign of. Some of the German medical men wrote about it, trying to fit this foreign horror into their books, and they were as baffled as the English had been. A killer that respected no walls, that outran every warning, that seemed to appear in 2 cities on the same morning without any traceable road between them. The speed of its passage across the continent is genuinely hard to hold in the mind. Within a matter of weeks in the late summer and early autumn of 1529, it had gone from a single ship in Hamburg to the Baltic ports, to Denmark and Scandinavia, deep into the German interior, and east toward Poland and beyond. Trade routes carried it, the same busy channels of ships and carts and merchants that carried grain and cloth and coin, and along those routes the disease moved with the traffic and dropped off into each town in turn and burned. Then, having crossed and scorched an enormous swath of northern Europe and killed a number of people that no one could ever properly count, it pulled back and left, and the continent never saw it again in the centuries that followed. Europe got one season of the English sweat, one concentrated dose of the terror England had lived with on and off for decades, and one season was enough to leave a mark in the chronicles of a dozen cities. And then the sweat went home to England, if home is the word for it, to wait more than 20 years and rise one last time. A geographic strangeness runs all through this story, and the disease flatly refuses to behave the way a disease is supposed to behave. The sweat spared France almost completely, even in 1529 when it was rampaging through the German-speaking world right next door across an open border. The single French exception was Calais, and Calais at that time was English soil, an English enclave planted on the continental coast, so that exception very nearly proves the rule rather than breaking it. The disease largely left Scotland untouched across the whole run of outbreaks. It mostly spared Wales, and it dipped into Ireland only occasionally, and there are those pointed accounts from 1517 and 1528, where observers noticed that the sweat seemed to pick out the English specifically, striking them even when they were travelling abroad, while leaving foreigners who happened to be living in England relatively untouched. The Venetian ambassador remarked with some wonder on how few foreign visitors seemed to fall ill compared to the natives all around them. That's precisely why the Latin name stuck fast, Suda Anglicus, the English sweat, because it really did seem to have a particular appetite for English blood, and nobody then, and nobody since, has ever fully explained why one people should be singled out by an illness, while their neighbours across a river went free. Back up with me for a moment to 1502. A death from the early Tudor years sits right at the edge of this story, one that a good many people have connected to the sweat, and whether or not the sweat was truly responsible, it reshaped the entire century that followed. Arthur, Prince of Wales. Arthur was Henry VII's eldest son, the golden hope of the whole new dynasty, the boy deliberately named after the legendary once and future king, to broadcast the message that a glorious new age had dawned in England. In November of 1501, he married Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish princess and the daughter of two of the most powerful monarchs in Europe, in a spectacular London wedding that was meant to anchor England's place among the great powers for a generation. The young couple were then sent off westward to Ludlow Castle, out on the wild Welsh border, to hold court together as Prince and Princess of Wales, learning the business of rule. And there, in the spring of 1502, they both fell gravely and suddenly ill. Catherine survived it. Arthur did not. He died on the 2nd of April, 1502, at just 15 years of age, only about 4.5 months after his glittering wedding. What actually killed him has been argued over for centuries. And I'm not going to hand you a tidy verdict, because the plain and honest answer is that nobody can be sure, and anyone who tells you they are certain is telling you more than the evidence allows. The contemporary description of his final illness spoke vaguely of a malign vapor that proceeded from the air, which tells us almost nothing useful at all. Down the long years since, doctors and historians have proposed consumption, meaning tuberculosis, along with pneumonia, testicular cancer, diabetes, and even an atypical form of cystic fibrosis. And a good number of serious scholars have argued for the sweating sickness. There are real reasons to lean that way. Arthur had seemed perfectly healthy at his wedding back in November, and he had performed his full religious duties just 9 days before his death. So whatever took him worked fast and hard on a boy who had shown no sign of any long decline. Catherine catching the very same illness at the very same time, and then pulling through it, fits a sudden contagious sweat rather neatly. On the other side of it, the sweat usually finished its victims off inside a single day, whereas Arthur seems to have faded over the better part of a week, and there's no record of a broad sweat epidemic sweeping the country in 1502 the way there is for the Great Outbreak years. When his tomb at Worcester Cathedral was opened and examined by researchers in 2002, exactly 500 years after he died, they could not determine what had killed him. So the question just sits there, unresolved and probably unresolvable. A 15-year-old prince dead on the Welsh border of something that might well have been the same disease we've been following all this time. Whatever the cause, hold on to what Arthur's death actually did, because the ripple that spread out from that sickbed at Ludlow is honestly staggering when you follow it. His younger brother, a boisterous, spoiled second son who had never once been groomed to wear a crown, who had been marked out instead for the church, suddenly became heir to the throne of England. That second son was Henry, the future Henry VIII. Catherine of Aragon, widowed at 16, was in time married to that younger brother instead of the elder she had first been sent for, and the deep, aching uncertainty over whether her first marriage to Arthur had ever truly been consummated, whether those two teenagers had really shared a bed as man and wife in that cold castle on the border, became the exact legal hinge on which Henry VIII would later try to wrench himself free of her. Every wife Henry took and used and destroyed, the whole break with Rome, the birth of the English Reformation, the dissolution of the monasteries, the executions, the whole blood-drenched drama of the middle Tudor century, all of it can be traced back through Catherine's long widowhood to that sickbed at Ludlow in the spring of 1502. If the sweat did kill Arthur, and it may well have, then a disease that killed in a matter of hours quietly redrew the entire religious map of England by taking one particular teenage boy at exactly the wrong moment in exactly the wrong bed. 1551 then, the last time the sweat ever came to England. We know more about this outbreak than any of the others. It gave us the careful physician who finally studied the thing properly, and it ends on a scene at a quiet country house that I don't think you'll get out of your head once you've heard it. This final visitation seems to have begun in the spring of 1551 in Shrewsbury, out in the west of England, near the Welsh border once again. It struck that town brutally. The estimates put the dead at somewhere around 900 to 1,000 people in Shrewsbury alone, though as always I'd handle that figure with some care, because the man who gave us the specific number of 960 was working from Caius, and a careful later medical writer pointed out that Caius simply states that many died in one city, and even raised the question of whether Caius had personally been present in Shrewsbury at all when it happened. Either way, however you count it, the town suffered terribly, and from there the disease spread out across England through the warm months of that summer, town after town, in its old familiar rhythm. The physician who took it upon himself to study this last outbreak in earnest was John Caius, and he is genuinely worth knowing. Without him, we would be very nearly blind about this whole disease. Caius was one of the most learned doctors in all of England, a man who had studied medicine in Italy at the feet of the finest scholars of the age, and who would go on to refound a Cambridge college that still carries his name to this day, Gonville and Caius. When the sweat came in 1551, Caius set out to do something no English physician had ever really done before. He wrote a full, careful account of a disease in the English language, for ordinary people rather than for other scholars in Latin, describing its symptoms and its course and its stages, and setting out how he believed people ought to be treated when it struck. He called the little book a boke or conseil against the disease commonly called the Swater, and he published it in 1552, the year after the outbreak, while it was all still raw and fresh in his mind. Almost every precise thing we know about how the sweat actually behaved inside the human body comes from that one book. Caius stood in the middle of the horror, watched the disease work its way through people, and wrote it all down while the sweat was still practically damp on the sheets, and every account you have ever come across of this disease, including the detailed one I gave you earlier, ultimately rests on the notes of that one careful, frightened, meticulous man doing his best in the middle of a nightmare. Caius had his own theories about why the disease struck, and I find them a fascinating mixture of sharp first-hand observation and the deep prejudices of his time. He blamed dirt and filth. He blamed foul mists and bad air and rotten fruit. And he blamed a kind of general softness, a moral and physical weakness that he was convinced had crept into the English character. He wrote, in a passage that's half careful medicine and half thundering sermon, that the old manly hardness and stout courage and capacity for hard, painful work of England had been utterly driven away, and that men in his own day received a kind of womanliness in its place. He genuinely seemed to believe that the English had gone weak and comfortable and lazy, and that they were being scourged for it by a disease that happened to target the comfortable and the idle. Whether or not you buy his reasoning, and it is very much not the reasoning of modern medicine, you can feel the man reaching, straining for some explanation, any explanation at all, for why the strong and the prosperous and the well-fed were the ones dropping dead while the poor and the hungry were passed over. When the world stops making sense, people reach for a story, and Caius reached for the one his age handed him. He also left us the lines about the sheer speed and cruelty of it, the ones I quoted near the very start of all this. He wrote that it killed some in a single hour and many in 2, and that to those who had dined in good cheer it gave a sorrowful supper. He described how it seized people in every possible state a person could be in, asleep and awake, in mirth and in sorrow, fasting and full, busy and idle, sparing none of these conditions. and he described the way it emptied out whole houses, 3 dead under one roof, sometimes 5, sometimes 7, sometimes 8, sometimes more, sometimes every last soul in the building, and that if half the people in any given town managed to escape it, that was reckoned a great mercy from God. Sit with that a moment. In Caius's own careful account, losing only half your town was the good outcome, the one you prayed for. The pattern of that final summer is easy enough to follow. The sweat behaved in 1551 exactly as it always had, and the country recognized it instantly. It came out of the west and moved east, town by town, along the roads and the river crossings and the market routes, arriving in a place, killing hard for a week or two, and then lifting and going on ahead of the news of itself. Word travelled with it, and sometimes behind it, so that a town might hear the sweat was coming a day after it had already arrived. People fled toward places the disease had not reached and carried it there in their own bodies, spreading it faster by running from it. That has happened in every epidemic in human history, and it will keep happening as long as human beings are frightened and mobile. By July it was in London. By high summer it had worked its way through much of England. And everywhere it went, the same scenes played out that had played out in 1485 and 1517 and 1528. The drenched beds, the shaking of the sleepers, the hurried burials, the market squares gone quiet. The same disease doing the same work in the same hours to a new generation of people who had grown up hearing their parents talk about it. Caius, standing in the middle of this, was doing something quietly remarkable. He was trying to be exact. In an age when medicine ran on inherited authority and physicians would rather cite an ancient Greek than look at a patient, Caius was watching, counting, comparing, setting down what he actually observed rather than what the books told him he ought to observe. He noted the stages. He timed them. He recorded who died and who lived and what seemed to make the difference. He wrote it in English, in plain language, so that ordinary people who would never touch a Latin text could use it and perhaps save someone. He got things wrong, of course, and his explanations for the cause of the disease were the explanations of his century filth and mists and moral softness. But his description of the illness itself is so precise and so careful that doctors and historians are still working from it 500 years later, still turning his sentences over, still trying to match his symptoms to a pathogen we can name. Every argument about what the sweat was is, in the end, an argument about what John Caius saw. The London chronicler Henry Mackin kept a diary through these very years, and his entries for the summer of 1551 let you feel the fear moving through the capital in something close to real time, in the plain, half-spelled, urgent language of a man scribbling down what he saw around him. He noted that around the 7th of July, a new sweat began in London. He noted that on the 10th of July, the king, young Edward VI by this point, a boy on the throne, removed himself from Westminster to Hampton Court because people were dying near the court itself. He wrote that many merchants and great rich men and women, young men and old, were dying of the new sweat. And he recorded the deaths that gave this final outbreak its most famous and most pitiful victims, the 2 young Dukes of Suffolk, dead, he wrote, both of them in one bed in Cambridgeshire on the 16th of July. Machin got a few of the small details slightly off, the way diarists scribbling in a panic always do, but the core of what he set down is one of the saddest things in the entire history of this disease. Here is what happened to the Brandon boys. Henry and Charles Brandon were the two sons of Charles Brandon, the first Duke of Suffolk, who had been Henry VIII's great friend and jousting companion and brother-in-law, and of Catherine Willoughby, one of the most formidable and intelligent women of the whole age. These two boys were the future of that great family, the bearers of its name and its blood into the next generation. They were students together at St. John's College in Cambridge, young, promising, well-born. And when the sweat came sweeping toward Cambridge in the summer of 1551, their guardians did exactly what everyone with the means to do it did. They moved the boys somewhere they thought would be safer. They were taken to the Bishop of Lincoln's palace at Buckden in Huntingdonshire, out in the countryside, to wait out the danger away from the crowded, infected town. It did not work. The sweat found them there anyway, in their supposed refuge, the same way it had found Ammonio in his rented country lodging 30 years before. Henry Brandon, the elder brother, the second Duke of Suffolk, fell ill and died first. He was 15 years old. His younger brother, Charles, was 14. And in the very moment of his elder brother's death, Charles inherited the dukedom and became, in that instant, the third Duke of Suffolk, and he held that grand title for something like half an hour to an hour before the sweat killed him too. It was one of the shortest tenures of any peerage in the whole of English history, a dukedom measured not in years or even in days, but in the length of time it took a 14-year-old boy to die in the same house where his brother's body was already lying and cooling. Both of them dead in a single afternoon, of the same disease, under the same roof, one right after the other, the younger inheriting everything from the elder, only long enough to carry it into the grave with him. Their mother, Catherine Willoughby, was ill with the sweat herself when it happened, and she reached Buckden as the second boy was dying. She arrived to find one son already gone and the other slipping away right in front of her eyes, and there was nothing any physician on earth could do about it, because there was nothing anyone could do about the sweat, except keep the doomed awake and pray. Both her sons, the whole future of her husband's line, gone in an afternoon, while she lay sick and helpless beside them. The boys were buried privately and quickly because of the terror of contagion. No grand ducal funeral with all the pomp their rank demanded, just a hurried interment of two teenagers out in the countryside, while the disease was very possibly still in the house. A proper memorial service was held later that autumn, in September of 1551, and one account describes the lamentation at that service, the open grief that so noble a family, so ancient and honourable a stock, had been snuffed out and extinguished in these two children. The male line of the Brandon Dukes of Suffolk simply ended, right there, in that afternoon at Buckden. A great house, generations in the building, gone in the time it takes to lose one summer's day, because a sickness that killed in hours got past the walls that were supposed to keep two boys safe. A small awful wrinkle sits in the timeline. Some accounts, including Mashin's, place the boys' deaths a day or two apart, while the more careful reconstruction has them dying within that single hour of each other on the 14th of July. Whether it was 1 hour or 1 day, barely changes the horror of the thing. 2 brothers, the last of their line, sent away to safety, dead almost simultaneously in a borrowed house, and a sick mother arriving too late to do anything at all but watch her family end. Catherine Willoughby lived on after that afternoon, and she carried the mark of it for the rest of her life. She had already buried her famous husband, the old First Duke, some years before. Now the 2 sons who had been her whole future, the boys who were meant to grow into men and carry the Brandon name forward and stand at the centre of the next generation of the English court, were gone in the span of an afternoon, both of them, the elder and then the younger, one inheriting from the other only long enough to die. She survived her own illness that summer, recovered from the same sweat that had killed her children while she lay too sick to reach them in time. To be spared by the very thing that took everything from you is its own particular cruelty. She would go on to a dramatic later life, a woman of strong Protestant conviction who fled abroad into exile during the reign of Mary Tudor to save her own skin and her faith, wandering the continent with a young family from a second marriage, hunted and poor and far from home. But whatever else happened to Catherine Willoughby, and a great deal did, she was always also the mother who rode toward Buckden in the summer of 1551 and got there just in time to watch the second boy go. The disease hollowed out the ones it left standing too, and it left a great many mothers and widows and orphaned children in emptied houses, staring at beds that had been full a day before. And these were only the names we happen to know, the ones grand enough to be written down, mourned in memorial services, argued over by later historians. Behind every duke's son there were thousands of ordinary children who died the same way in the same summers, in cottages that kept no registers beyond a line in a parish book, and thousands of ordinary parents who nursed them through the night and lost the fight against the sleep, and thousands of ordinary survivors who came out the far side of an outbreak into a house gone silent. The sweat did not sort its victims by rank when it came into a room. A bishop's palace and a labourer's cottage looked the same to it. The only thing it seemed to care about was that its victims be young and strong and full of a life that had every reason to expect a great many more years, and it took that life in hours, and left the record of the taking scattered across chronicles and diaries and burial books and one careful physician's counsel for us to sit with now and shudder at across 5 centuries. The nicknames the disease picked up that year tell you a great deal about how people actually experienced it. They called it the posting sweat because it posted from town to town, moving across the country like a royal messenger galloping flat out with dispatches, never resting, always somewhere new by morning. And they repeated, about that final year, a version of the old grim line, that there were people dancing in the court at 9 o'clock at night who were dead by 11. 2 hours, from the dance floor to the grave, from music and candlelight and movement to a corpse. That was the tempo of this thing, over and over, in outbreak after outbreak across 66 years, the same impossible contemptuous speed, as if death simply could not be bothered to take its time with anyone. By 1551, England had been living with this thing, on and off, for 3 generations. There were old men and women alive that summer who had been children during the first outbreak in 1485, who could remember the mayors dying 2 days apart and the coronation delayed, and who had then lived through 1508 and 1517 and 1528, burying friends and family in each one, and were now watching it come around yet again. The sweat was woven into the memory of the whole country by then, a recurring terror that arrived with the warm weather like an unwelcome season, feared and half expected, spoken about in the way people speak about a thing that has already taken someone they loved. Parents who had survived one outbreak nursed their own children through the next. The disease had become almost a fixture of English life, a horror the country had learned to brace for without ever learning to stop, and no one alive in 1551 had any reason to think this outbreak would be the last. They braced, as they always had, for it to come back again in a few years' time, as it always had. It never did. And then, after 1551, the sweat vanished, not slowly, not with a long, tapering, merciful decline that let people believe it was ending. It simply stopped coming. The disease that had terrorized England across 5 great outbreaks over 66 years, that had killed Lord Mayors and princes and dukes and cardinals' friends, and drowned untold thousands of ordinary people in their own sweat, that had chased a king from house to house across his own kingdom, and reached its hand right into the Reformation, just left, and it never once came back. There's a stray, isolated mention of a sweating sickness at Tiverton in Devon in 1644, with some 443 deaths recorded, but the details of it are far too thin to say with any confidence whether it was truly the same disease, and it falls nearly a century after the accepted end of the story. For every practical purpose, the sweat's last word in England was that afternoon at Buckden and the summer of dying around it, and after that, nothing. Silence. An empty space where a monster used to be. That disappearance is one of the 2 great mysteries hanging over this whole subject, like a fog that never quite lifts. Why did it come and why did it go? A disease that dramatic, that lethal, that distinctive and specific, does not usually just switch itself off and walk away. Diseases fade, they mutate, they become endemic and grumble along in the background for centuries. This one appeared as suddenly as a thunderclap at Bosworth, and then, after 1551, was simply gone, as abruptly as it had arrived, leaving behind a scatter of terrified chronicles and one careful little book by John Caius, and a great pile of questions that have never been answered, and possibly never will be. The other great mystery, of course, the one that has kept doctors and historians arguing for a very long time, is what the disease actually was. And here I want to be careful to lay the possibilities out in front of you rather than pronounce some courtroom verdict from on high, because the plain truth is that no one has ever proven the cause, and the people who study it seriously are still genuinely, openly divided about it. The molecular approach that has cracked open so many other old diseases, the technique of pulling ancient DNA out of old teeth and bones and tracing the ghost of a pathogen inside them, has so far failed here because we don't have securely identified sweat victims with recoverable genetic material to test. Nobody can point to a grave and say with certainty, that person there died of the sweat, dig them up and let's look. So all anyone can really do is match the symptoms and the strange behavior of the disease against things we do understand and see what fits and what doesn't. The candidate that gets the most attention in our own time is a hantavirus, some unknown or now vanished member of that family of viruses. Hantaviruses are carried by rodents, by mice and rats and voles, and they spread to people through contact with rodent droppings and urine, often dust breathed in from contaminated grain stores and barns and dirty houses. Certain hantaviruses cause a syndrome with some real striking overlaps to the sweat, a sudden violent onset, high fever, crushing muscle pain, and in the very worst cases, a rapid catastrophic failure of the lungs, with fluid flooding into the chest and the victim drowning internally, or else a collapse of the kidneys. A pair of studies published in the late 1990s and later work published in 2014 argued the hantavirus case in careful detail, pointing to the rural pattern of the outbreaks, the seasonal timing in the warm months, and that rodent connection. The rural angle really does fit well. Plague was mainly a disease of crowded cities and their rats. The sweat hammered the open countryside just as hard as the towns, and a rodent-borne disease spreading through villages and farms and grain stores would behave in exactly that way. There are problems with the theory too, though, and the honest researchers admit them plainly. Most known hantaviruses don't pass at all easily from person to person, and the sweat certainly seemed to spread between people, jumping through households and along trade routes and onto ships, the way that vessel apparently carried it to Hamburg. There was one documented outbreak in Argentina of a hantavirus that did appear to transmit directly from human to human, so it's not impossible, but it is genuinely unusual. And modern hantaviruses do not simply vanish off the earth the way the English sweat did after 1551. Other possibilities have been put forward across the years, and they're all worth a moment. Some have suggested a relapsing fever spread by lice or by ticks, which does tend to strike in the summer months, though it usually leaves a telltale mark or eschar at the site of the bite and very often a rash. And the sweat was famously and consistently free of any rash at all. A microbiologist proposed back in 2004 that the culprit might have been inhaled anthrax, spores breathed in from infected wool or from the carcasses of diseased animals, and given how much of the English economy ran on wool and sheep, it's not a foolish idea. And he even suggested digging up sweat victims to test for it. Some have leaned toward an influenza-like virus, or some other viral disease that attacked the lungs, which would sit well with those early descriptions from Forestier and others of vapors gathering around the heart and the lungs, and people struggling and failing to breathe. Ergotism, poisoning from a fungus that grows on damp grain, has mostly been set aside, largely because England grew comparatively little of the rye that ergot favours. And a fair number of researchers, after weighing all of it, end up in the honest and deeply unsatisfying place of concluding that the sweat may simply have been a pathogen that no longer exists at all. A virus that blazed through its brief moment in history and then either died out completely or mutated away into something we would no longer recognize if we met it. A killer that came, did its work, and then erased itself from the record of living things. Part of what makes the sweat so maddening to the people who study it is how much it seems to promise and how little it finally gives. Every feature of the disease is a clue, sharp and specific and tantalizing, and yet the clues refuse to add up to an answer everyone can accept. The suddenness points one way, the rural spread points another, the taste for strong young men points a third, the sparing of Scotland and France points somewhere else again, and the clean disappearance after 1551 seems to argue against half the candidates all by itself. A disease that behaved in any one of these ways would be strange. A disease that behaved in all of them at once, over 66 years, and 5 outbreaks and 1 continental rampage, is something close to unique in the whole record of human sickness. And that uniqueness is exactly what keeps it unsolved. There is nothing quite like it still living for us to compare it against. The one thing that might genuinely crack it open is the same thing that has settled so many other old arguments: the recovery of the pathogen's own genetic material from the bodies of its victims. If a securely identified sweat burial could be found, a grave or a mass pit from one of the known outbreak years that could be confidently tied to the disease, and if the ancient DNA or RNA of whatever killed those people could be pulled out of their teeth or their bones and decoded, then centuries of guessing would end more or less overnight. We would finally know whether it was a hantavirus or an influenza or something we have never named at all. So far that hasn't happened, partly because the sweat killed and was buried in an age that kept poor records of who died of what, and partly because the very speed of the disease means there may be no distinctive trace left in the bones the way slower diseases sometimes leave their mark. Until someone opens the right grave and finds the right molecules waiting inside it, the sweat keeps its secret, and every account of it, including this one, has to end at the same locked door, able to describe the horror in exact detail and unable to name the thing that caused it. The people living through it had their own explanations, of course, and their fear and their reasoning are as much a part of this story as any modern lab work. They blamed bad air and foul mists, the miasma theory that dominated European medicine for centuries, the idea that disease rose up out of rotting matter and stagnant water and hung invisible in the atmosphere, waiting to be breathed. They blamed dirt, and here they were not entirely wrong to notice something, even if their understanding of it was upside down. Both Erasmus and Caius commented with disgust on English domestic habits, on the rushes strewn across the floors of houses and left down for years at a time, matted with spilled ale and grease and dropped scraps and dog mess and worse, on the general filth of ordinary dwellings. If the disease really did come from rodents in the grain and the muck, then all that filth was closer to the mark than they could have known, for entirely the wrong reasons. They blamed the damp English weather. They blamed the foreign mercenaries who had come over with Henry Tudor, and Caius, as we saw, blamed a moral softness, a whole nation gone weak and being whipped for it. Running underneath very many of these explanations was the oldest one of all, the belief that the sweat was a punishment sent down from God, a judgment on the sins of the people, or an omen about the new dynasty, or a warning to a wicked and comfortable generation. In an age when a strong, healthy man could be dead by supper for no reason anyone alive could see or explain, reaching for the wrath of heaven was not madness. It was the only framework anyone had that was large enough to hold a terror that size. a weather thread runs through this as well. The outbreak years really do seem to cluster around particular conditions. Several of them followed hard winters and long spells of heavy, soaking rain, exactly the conditions that make rodent populations boom in the following season, which loops us right back around to the hantavirus idea and its rodents. This whole period was also the beginning of the long stretch of centuries we now call the Little Ice Age, with its cooler temperatures and its erratic, unreliable seasons, and it is at the very least suggestive that a strange new killing disease should appear in England, just as the climate itself was lurching into something colder and stranger and less predictable. I'm not going to sit here and tell you the weather caused the sweat, because I don't know that and neither does anyone. I'm telling you that the two things overlap in the record, and that the people who spend their careers trying to solve this puzzle keep coming back to that overlap and turning it over, looking for the connection they can feel but cannot quite prove. The sweat has one possible relative, one faint echo of itself, and it turned up long after England had convinced itself the whole thing was over and done. In 1718, roughly a century and a half after the English sweat's final visit to Buckden, a disease broke out in the Picardy region of northern France, and it looked hauntingly, uncomfortably familiar to anyone who knew the old accounts. They called it the Picardy sweat, the Suette des Picards. It caused a long run of localized outbreaks scattered across France, something like 196 of them by some counts, stretching across the 1700s and well into the 1800s, and it apparently faded out around 1861, though scattered cases were still recorded later, including a sizable outbreak in 1906 that a French bacteriologist studied closely and blamed on the fleas of field mice, and what may have been one last isolated case in a soldier in 1918. The Picardy sweat was far less deadly than its terrible English predecessor and far more frequent, popping up again and again in small local flares, rather than arriving in rare nation-shaking waves. There was one clear and important difference between the two diseases. The Picardy sweat almost always came with a rash, a fine eruption spreading across the skin and lasting about a week, and the English sweat had shown no rash whatsoever. One physician who studied both of them carefully argued that this wasn't really a true divide at all, that the English cases had simply killed their victims far too fast for any rash to have time to develop, that the sufferers were dead and buried before their skin ever had the chance to break out, and he found no strong reason to doubt that the two diseases were fundamentally one and the same thing, wearing slightly different faces in different centuries. Other researchers aren't nearly so sure, and the question stays open. Both are now sometimes chalked up, tentatively and with plenty of caveats, to hantavirus infection. And that rodent connection buried in the Picardy outbreaks, those fleas of the field mice, is exactly the clue that keeps the whole hantavirus conversation alive and breathing, a thin thread running all the way from a French village in 1906 back through the centuries to the corpse-choked streets of London in the autumn of 1485. The ordinary people caught up in all of this are the ones who stay with me, the ones who never got so much as a line in a chronicle. The famous deaths are only the visible tip of an enormous submerged mass of dying. For every prince or duke or cardinal's friend we can name and mourn, there were thousands upon thousands of nameless people who felt that first cold prickle at the back of the neck and knew, because by then everyone knew, exactly what it probably meant, and had a few hours to make their peace with it if they were lucky, and sometimes not even that. A parish study of the 1551 outbreak, digging through the burial registers of country churches, found the disease spiking and then vanishing very quickly in rural communities, tearing through a village in a matter of days and then gone, riding along what one description calls a fragile chain of infection, jumping from one person to the next along lines that could snap and break as suddenly as they had formed. Halifax Parish recorded 44 deaths that year in its register. Multiply that one quiet, unremarkable number across hundreds and hundreds of parishes the length and breadth of England, and you begin to feel the real scale of it, not the dramatic deathbed scenes at court, but the steady, relentless emptying of ordinary households, the farmer dead in his own field, the wife dead at her own hearth, the children carried out and buried in a hurry, the whole living texture of a working village coming apart at the seams inside a single terrible fortnight. And then, just as fast, the sickness lifting and moving on down the road to the next place, leaving the survivors to bury their dead and wonder why they had been spared. The disease did more than kill individuals, though. It reached into the working machinery of the whole country and jammed it. The universities felt it worst and earliest again and again because Oxford and Cambridge packed hundreds of young men, exactly the age and sex the sweat hunted, into close shared lodgings and crowded halls, and a disease that liked young men in close quarters could hardly have asked for a better feeding ground. In the bad years, the scholars scattered, the lectures stopped, the colleges emptied out and locked their gates, and the whole rhythm of learning in England simply halted until the danger passed. The Brandon boys, remember, had been Cambridge students moved out of the town for safety, and they were only the most famous of countless students whose studies, and in their case whole lives, were cut short by the same summer terror. The law felt it too. The courts at Westminster kept their terms, their fixed sessions when cases were heard and business was done, and when the sweat was in London, those terms had to be adjourned or moved, the judges and lawyers and clerks fleeing along with everyone else, so that justice itself paused and disputes hung unresolved, and men waited, sometimes in prison, for a system that had gone quiet. Trade seized up in the same way. Shops shut. Markets thinned or closed. The great fairs where goods changed hands were dangerous places to be in an outbreak year, crowds being exactly what you wanted to avoid, and so commerce stalled and money stopped moving, and the ordinary buying and selling that fed a town dried up for weeks at a stretch. Worst of all, in some years, was the timing against the harvest. The sweat favoured the warm months, and the warm months were also the months when the grain had to be cut and gathered and the year's food secured, and a disease that struck down strong adult men in the fields at harvest time did not only kill those men, it threatened everyone who would have eaten the grain they failed to bring in. A village that lost its strongest laborers in July could face hunger in the winter that followed, the death reaching forward in time to starve the survivors, so that the true toll of an outbreak was never only the fresh graves in the churchyard, but the thin, hard months that came after for the people left behind to manage with fewer hands. The disease killed once with the sweat, and then threatened to kill again, quietly, months later, through an empty granary and a long, cold winter. Consider how you would actually have lived if you had been there, knowing that this was possible at any moment through the whole of the warm season. A rumour of the sweat in the next town over, and those who could afford to flee would already be packing their carts and abandoning their shops and their business, and sometimes, God help them, their own sick, because to stay and nurse the sick was to risk the same reeking death yourself. Houses of the infected were marked, sometimes with a simple wisp of straw hung outside, and later in some places with a painted cross, so that everyone would know to keep well away. A household under the sweat might send one person out to do the necessary shopping, carrying a white stick held up in plain sight, a warning to everyone in the market and the street to give them a wide berth and let them pass untouched. The sick were sometimes simply shut up and left, the door closed on them, to survive the 24 hours or not survive them entirely on their own, abandoned to the outcome, because human beings are frightened animals and self-preservation is a powerful and ancient thing. Du Bellai's dark little line about London during the outbreak captures the collapse of ordinary human care about as sharply as anything could, when he wrote that the priests there had a better time of it than the physicians, except that there simply weren't enough of them left to bury all the dead. The dying outpaced the burying. The men whose whole job it was to put people decently in the ground could not keep up with the work, and the bodies waited. The treatment itself, the famous regimen, was its own strange and exhausting ordeal for everyone involved. The moment the first symptoms hit, the standard advice was to get the sufferer straight into bed and then keep them at a perfectly even, steady temperature for a full 24 hours, not too hot and not too cold, because any swing either way seemed capable of killing them, that peacock stiff seizing that Du Bellai described from merely letting a bare hand slip out into the cool air. They were given very little food. Their drink was strictly limited. And above all, above everything else, they had to be kept awake, dragged back from that crushing, sucking pull towards sleep every single time it came for them, over and over, for a whole day and a whole night, because the sleepers did not wake. Caius recommended his own particular mixtures of herbs and advised staying well away from evil mists and rotten fruit and keeping to a moderate, unchanging warmth. Grafton's Chronicle preserves that bed rest regimen for us, and you can hold in your mind the exhausted family members taking their shifts through the long, dark hours, shaking a raving, drenched, foul-smelling relative awake again and again and again, pinching them, shouting their name into their face, walking them stumbling up and down the room, doing anything and everything to keep those heavy eyes open until the sun finally came up on the far side of the crisis, knowing all the while that if they failed for even a single hour, if sleep won even once, The person soaking that bed was as good as dead, and it would be, in some small, terrible way, their fault for letting go. The physicians of the day were, in truth, almost entirely helpless against it, and some of them were honest enough to more or less admit as much. Tudor medicine ran on the ancient theory of the four humours, the notion that health was a balance of blood and phlegm and the two biles, and that sickness meant one of them had run to excess and needed to be drawn off or countered. Against most illnesses that gave a doctor at least something to do, bleeding, purging, sweating a patient out, prescribing herbs to cool or to heat the body back into balance. Against the sweat, that whole apparatus was next to useless, because the disease moved faster than any treatment could work, and killed before the theory had any time to be tested. A physician summoned to a sickbed might arrive to find the patient already delirious and drenched, and hours from death, with nothing to offer but the vigil against sleep and whatever herbal draught he trusted, and then have to stand there and watch and hope and go home to find the same thing waiting in his own house. Caius, for all his learning and his careful book, was really only codifying what desperate experience had already taught people. Keep them warm and even and awake and alive through the first day, and pray. So people reached, as people do, for anything that might work. They tried herbal concoctions of every description, treacle and vinegar, and marigold, and endless combinations of whatever the local wisdom swore by. They tried amulets and charms and written prayers worn against the skin. They burned herbs and lit fires to drive off the bad air they blamed for it, filling rooms with smoke in the belief that a foul enough atmosphere could not hold the sickness. The wealthy sent for the best physicians money could buy, as Henry sent Dr. Butts to Anne, and the best physicians money could buy could do very little more than the frightened family at the bedside. And when medicine failed, and it mostly failed, people turned to the church, which had its own answers ready. Special prayers and processions and days of fasting were appointed to beg God to lift the scourge, sermons that framed the sweat as a punishment for sin and called the people to repentance. The whole spiritual machinery of a deeply religious age mobilized against an enemy no one could see. Whether any of it moved the disease 1 inch is not a question the record can answer. What it did was give terrified people something to do with their terror, a prayer to say, a candle to light, a way of feeling less utterly at the mercy of a thing that struck without warning and killed before nightfall. Plague, we remember. The Black Death sits burned into every schoolbook and every imagination, and the great pandemics that reshape the world get their documentaries and their solemn anniversaries. The sweat got almost none of that. A disease that could take a strong man between 2 courses at dinner, that emptied whole houses in an afternoon and drove a terrified king to flee back and forth across his own country, has slipped clean out of the common memory, and it went quietly, without much fuss, the way it had arrived. What it left behind is thin enough to hold in 2 hands. A careful little book by one meticulous physician, a scatter of frightened letters, some hurried lines in chronicles and parish registers, written by men who did not understand what they were burying. And underneath all of it, the question that has never once been answered in all the centuries since, the question of what exactly walked through England in those years, and where on earth it went when it was finished, and whether that first cold prickle at the back of the neck could ever, under some unlucky arrangement of weather and rodents and rot, come climbing back. The last we can really see of it in England is that summer of 1551, and the last true image the whole long story leaves us with is that house at Buckden. 2 boys sent out of Cambridge to keep them safe, a mother riding hard toward them, already sick herself, already sweating in the saddle, and the disease getting there first, ahead of her, and finishing both of her sons, one right after the other, inside the span of a single ordinary summer afternoon, before she ever reached the door and climbed the stairs and found what was waiting for her in that room. That's where I'll let the sweat rest. Thanks for staying with me through it. I know it wasn't a light one. And if you want to help me keep digging into the corners of history nobody else bothers with, the Patreon and the YouTube membership links are down in the description and in the pinned comment. Everyone who's already there, you have my thanks, sincerely. Look after yourselves out there, sleep well tonight, and I'll see you soon.